There's something hauntingly beautiful about autumn nights, the way the crisp air carries whispers of old stories, the rustle of dry leaves like secrets begging to be uncovered. And few tales send shivers down the spine, quite like the legend of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to walk through those shadowy woods, where every gust of wind might hide the sound of galloping hooves, where the line between folklore and reality blurs into something far more chilling? Tonight, we're stepping into that world together, tracing the footsteps of a man who dared to question the darkness and paid the price for his curiosity. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? Is it late where you are, the moon high in the sky, or perhaps the first light of dawn is just creeping over the horizon? Let us know in the comments below. There's something special about sharing this moment with you, no matter where or when your journey into this story begins. Picture this: a quiet village nestled in the Hudson Valley, where the trees are aflame with the colors of fall, and the nights grow longer, colder. Into this sleepy town arrives Ichabod Crane, a school teacher with a sharp mind and a skeptic's heart. He's heard the murmurs, the nervous glances between villagers, the way they lower their voices when speaking of the Headless Horseman. To him, it's nothing more than superstition, a story spun to frighten children. But Sleepy Hollow has a way of making even the most rational minds question what they think they know. As Ichabod digs deeper, he'll find that some legends are rooted in truths far darker than he could have imagined. And tonight, we're following his path, unraveling the mystery piece by eerie piece. So settle in, dear listener, because this isn't just a tale. It's an invitation to step into the unknown. The woods are waiting, and so is he. The night wrapped around Ichabod Crane like a heavy cloak, the creaking of old floorboards beneath his feet, the only sound in the quiet farmhouse where he'd taken lodgings. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of something unnatural. At first, he dismissed it as imagination, just the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl. But then it came again, a rhythmic pounding, steady and deliberate, like the beat of a monstrous heart. Hoofbeats, too slow to belong to any ordinary rider, too heavy for any living horse. A laugh sliced through the darkness then, sharp and humorless, sending a spider's crawl of ice down his spine. The villagers' warnings echoed in his mind, but Ichabod was a man of reason, wasn't he? There had to be an explanation, perhaps a drunkard stumbling home, or a prankster playing on old fears. Clenching his jaw, he crossed to the window, fingers trembling only slightly as he pushed back the threadbare curtain. Moonlight spilled across the road, painting it silver, and for just a heartbeat, he saw it. A towering figure astride a massive horse, its silhouette black as pitch against the night. The rider's cloak billowed behind him like smoke, but where a head should have been, there was nothing, just empty space, a void that seemed to swallow the light itself. Ichabod's breath caught in his throat. His mind scrabbled for logic. A trick of the shadows, a cloak draped over a saddle, anything. But the figure turned then, as if sensing his gaze, and though it had no eyes, Ichabod felt the weight of its attention. The horse reared, and in that moment, the schoolteacher's certainty crumbled. The hoofbeats faded into the trees, leaving behind silence thicker than fog. The room felt colder now, the darkness pressing closer. For the first time since arriving in Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane wondered if the stories weren't just stories after all. And worse, if whatever lurked in those woods had just marked him as its next prey. The warmth of the tavern felt like a fragile shield against the night, pressing at its windows, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across the faces gathered there. Ichabod Crane sat hunched over a mug of cider, his fingers tight around the clay as if it could anchor him to reason. Across the rough-hewn table, Brom Bones leaned back in his chair, the smirk on his face as bold as the scar cutting through his eyebrow. "You don't believe in the horseman, schoolmaster?" Brom's voice boomed, drawing every eye in the room. A hush settled over the crowd, the air suddenly thick with something unspoken. Ichabod forced a thin smile, but his pulse betrayed him, quick and insistent, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Brom's tale unfurled like a storm rolling in. The Hessian soldier, beheaded by a cannonball in some forgotten battle, riding through the hollow each autumn with his head tucked beneath his arm, searching for a replacement. The villagers shifted in their seats, muttering prayers or clutching charms beneath the table. A woman near the hearth made the sign of the cross, her knuckles white around a frayed rosary. Ichabod's skepticism wavered as he watched their fear take shape in the trembling of hands, the darting of eyes toward the door. But then Brom's gaze locked onto him, sharp as the blade the horseman was said to carry. "They say he only comes for those who don't respect the dead," he mused, swirling his ale, "or those who think themselves too clever to fear the dark." The challenge hung between them, and Ichabod stiffened. He could almost hear Brom's unspoken dare, "Prove me wrong." The schoolmaster's pride flared, hot and bright. Ghosts were the stuff of fireside tales, not reason, certainly not for a man who prided himself on logic. Yet in the silence that followed Brom's words, the wind outside seemed to howl just a little louder, rattling the shutters like bony fingers testing the latch. And for the briefest moment, Ichabod wondered if the legend wasn't merely a story, but a warning one he was foolishly ignoring. Across the room, Brom's laughter rang out, too loud, too knowing. The villagers didn't join in. They simply stared into their drinks, as if they could already see the shape of what was coming. And Ichabod, for all his book learning, felt the first cold trickle of doubt slide down his spine. The Van Tassel estate glowed like a beacon against the autumn night, its windows spilling golden light onto the gravel drive where carriages lined up one after another. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of spiced cider and wood smoke, the murmur of laughter and fiddles weaving through the crowded rooms. Ichabod Crane moved through the party with uncharacteristic ease, his usual awkwardness softened by the warmth of good food and better company. And then there was Katrina, radiant in her emerald green dress, her smile like a secret just for him. Every glance she sent his way made his pulse skip, every brush of her fingers against his sleeve as she handed him another cup of cider sent heat crawling up his neck. Across the room, Brom Bones watched them with a storm brewing behind his eyes. He'd always assumed Katrina's hand was as good as his, hadn't he been the one racing horses with her since they were children, the one who made her laugh until her sides ached. But now here came this gangly schoolteacher with his fancy words and hungry eyes, stealing her attention like a thief in the night. Brom's grip tightened around his tankard, knuckles whitening. He wasn't a man used to losing, and he certainly wasn't about to start. The tension between them crackled like the fire in the hearth, unnoticed by the revelers, but sharp enough to cut. When Ichabod dared to lead Katrina into a dance, Brom's chair scraped back with a violence that silenced the nearest conversations. He didn't move, though, just sat there, a predator coiled and waiting, his grin all teeth. The message was clear: this isn't over. Later, as the party dwindled and the moon climbed high, Katrina pulled Ichabod aside beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak. Her usual playfulness had vanished, replaced by something urgent, almost fearful. "You shouldn't ride home tonight," she whispered, her breath a ghost against his cheek. "Not with the Hollow's roads so dark, not when the horseman rides," Ichabod chuckled, brushing off the chill that raced down his spine. "Surely you don't believe those old tales." Katrina's fingers dug into his sleeve. Brom does, and he knows these woods better than anyone. There it was, the unspoken threat, the reason for her fear. But Ichabod only straightened his coat, his pride flaring bright. Let Brom try his tricks. Let the villagers whisper. He was a man of reason, and reason had no room for headless phantoms or petty rivals. As he mounted his borrowed horse and rode into the ink-black night, he never noticed the shadow detaching itself from the trees near the gate, or the way Brom's laughter, low and knowing, followed him long after the estate had disappeared from view. The road through Sleepy Hollow had never felt so narrow, the trees pressing in like silent witnesses to Ichabod Crane's mounting unease. His horse, usually steady as stone, tossed its head with a nervous whicker, ears flicking at shadows even he couldn't see. The schoolteacher tightened his grip on the reins, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Easy now," he murmured, patting the animal's neck. Just the wind playing tricks, but the words tasted like a lie. The wind didn't carry the metallic tang of old gunpowder, didn't make the hair on his arms stand up as if charged by lightning. Then it came, the sound that turned his blood to ice. Hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster, matching the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He twisted in the saddle, squinting into the ink-black night. Nothing, just the empty road, the skeletal branches clawing at the moon. Relief washed over him until the galloping grew louder, closer, impossibly loud for a rider he still couldn't see. His horse reared with a shrill scream, nearly unseating him, and then light, a flicker of orange in the darkness, bobbing like a will-o', the wisp. The figure that emerged from the trees was no drunken farmer, no prankster in a borrowed cloak. The horse was massive, its eyes glowing like banked coals, its breath steaming in the cold air. The rider sat tall, his uniform tattered but unmistakable, a Hessian soldier's coat, the fabric singed as if by cannon fire. And where his head should have been nothing but darkness and the gleam of a saber raised high, but it was the pumpkin that sealed Ichabod's terror, cradled in the crook of the rider's arm, its jagged mouth grinning, its hollow eyes burning with unnatural fire. Logic shattered like glass. The schoolteacher who'd scoffed at ghost stories now kicked his horse into a gallop, his screams lost in the wind and the horseman's echoing laughter. Branches lashed at his face, the road vanishing beneath him as his panicked mount veered off the path. Behind him, the pounding of hooves never faltered, never faded. The flaming pumpkin sailed past his head, exploding against a tree in a shower of embers that stank of sulfur and rotting flesh. For the first time in his life, Ichabod Crane understood true fear, not the intellectual kind, but the primal, gut-deep certainty that death was riding at his heels, and it would not be reasoned with. The bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks the only barrier between him and the safety of the village. Local lore whispered that the horseman couldn't cross running water, that the bridge was his prison. Ichabod urged his horse faster, ribs heaving, prayers tumbling from his lips. Just a few more strides, a hand closed around his collar, yanking him backward. The world spun, the stars wheeling overhead as he hit the ground with a breath-stealing thud. Above him, the horseman's silhouette blotted out the moon, the saber glinting as it rose for the final strike. Ichabod squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the bite of steel, and then silence. The weight lifted, the hoofbeats faded. When he dared to look, the road was empty, the bridge intact. Only the stench of burnt pumpkin lingered, clinging to his coat like a warning. Trembling, he dragged himself to his feet. The village bells tolled midnight, their echoes skittering across the hollow. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, not his own, not any earthly beast. It was the sound of something ancient, something hungry, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The pounding of hooves against packed earth was deafening, a thunderous drumbeat, synced to the wild hammering of Ichabod's heart. His horse's sides heaved beneath him, lungs burning as they tore through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face like skeletal fingers, trying to claw him back. The horseman's laughter curled around him, a sound that wasn't just heard, but felt like the scrape of a blade against bone. Every instinct screamed to look back, but Ichabod knew the moment he turned, he'd see those empty shoulders, that grinning pumpkin clutched in the crook of an arm, its hollow eyes burning with malice. Then it hit him, the memory of old Van Ripper's words, muttered over a tankard of cider just days before. The devil can't cross running water, boy. That bridge is the only thing keeping him trapped in the hollow. The covered bridge loomed ahead, its weathered planks a fragile barrier between the living world and whatever hellish force pursued him. Ichabod wrenched the reins hard to the left, his mount skidding on damp leaves before surging forward. The river below roared, its currents churning black in the moonlight, but the bridge was his sanctuary. If he could just reach it. A gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the stench of damp earth and something older, fouler. The horseman's steed let out a scream that wasn't equine, wasn't natural, and suddenly the distance between them vanished. Ichabod's breath sawed in his throat. He could almost feel the heat of that spectral blade at his back, inches from claiming what the Hessian had lost so long ago. The bridge's entrance yawned before him, its shadowed interior a tunnel to safety. With a final desperate kick, Ichabod urged his horse onward. Hooves clattered against wood, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the night. Behind him, the horseman's furious howl shook the very air, but the pursuit faltered, just for a heartbeat. Ichabod dared a glance over his shoulder. The specter had reined in his mount at the bridge's edge, that headless silhouette trembling with rage. For one wild, giddy moment, Ichabod thought he'd won. Then the pumpkin left the horseman's grip. It arced through the air, flames licking its jagged mouth, and Ichabod barely had time to duck before it exploded against the bridge's far post. Embers rained down, hissing as they hit the water below. The message was clear: this isn't over. The bridge might stop the horseman's body, but his wrath, that could follow anywhere. And as Ichabod's horse stumbled into the moonlit fields beyond, He knew wherever he fled, whatever path he took, the hollow would always call him back. Some debts couldn't be outrun. The wooden planks of the bridge groaned under the frantic rhythm of hooves as Ichabod Crane clung to his horse's mane, the wind screaming in his ears. Every muscle in his body burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of iron and terror. He could almost feel the spectral rider's breath on his neck, cold, stale, reeking of grave dirt and gunpowder. The bridge's far side shimmered like a mirage, salvation just strides away. He leaned forward, urging his mount faster, faster than the world erupted in fire. The horseman's pumpkin struck the rail beside him with a sound like splitting bone, flames licking hungrily at the weathered wood. Heat seared Ichabod's cheek as he recoiled, his horse shrieking and rearing. For one suspended moment, he hung in the air, weightless, the stars spinning above him. Then impact, the breath crushed from his lungs as his back hit the bridge, the rough planks scraping through his coat. Above him, the horseman loomed, that headless void somehow more terrible than any face could be. The saber flashed downward, and Ichabod threw up an arm in a futile attempt to shield himself pain. White hot and sudden, radiating from his shoulder like liquid lightning, his vision swam, the edges darkening as the horseman's laughter coiled around him, thick as smoke. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the pumpkin's jagged grin, bobbing in the darkness like a second moon. Dawn crept over Sleepy Hollow with the hesitant grace of a mourner at a graveside. Mist curled along the riverbank, softening the edges of the bridge where Ichabod had made his final stand. The villagers who found the scene spoke in hushed tones. The scorch marks on the rail, the trampled earth, the schoolmaster's hat lying abandoned near the water's edge, its brim torn as if by frantic fingers. But of Ichabod himself, no trace, only a single ominous detail marred the otherwise ordinary morning. Deep, gouging hoof prints leading back into the hollow's heart, their edges crusted with something dark and damp. The kind of mark that couldn't be made by any living horse. And high in the branches of the old elm, near the bridge, unnoticed by the search party, a pumpkin sat wedged between the limbs, its surface blackened, its hollow eyes staring blindly toward the road. As if waiting, morning light spilled over Sleepy Hollow like thin broth, doing little to warm the chilled faces gathering near the bridge. Word had spread before sunrise, Ichabod Crane was gone. Not just missing, but vanished, with only his battered hat and the stench of burnt pumpkin to mark where he'd last stood. Katrina Van Tassel stood apart from the crowd, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, eyes red-rimmed but dry. She hadn't wept, not yet. There was something unnatural about the scene, something that made grief stick in her throat like a swallowed stone. Brom Bones arrived late, boots kicking up gravel as he strode toward the onlookers. His usual swagger was there, but sharper now, edged with something that made the villagers step back when he laughed too loud at the sheriff's questions. Probably ran off, Brom said, flicking a glance at Katrina. Men like him always do when things get real. The words hung in the air, weighted with a meaning only she seemed to catch. Her fingers tightened around her shawl. Old Mike van der Veen, who'd lived through 80 winters in the hollow, crossed herself and spat into the dirt. The horseman took him, she muttered, just like he took young Pieter back in 76. A ripple passed through the crowd at the name Pieter van Gerrit. whose headless body they'd found floating near the mill pond all those years ago. The same year, Brom's father had won the Van Tassel lands in that questionable card game. Coincidence? The villagers exchanged glances, but said nothing. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. By midday, the whispers had teeth. Didn't Brom know these woods better than anyone? Hadn't he boasted just last week that no outsider could steal what was his? And why, when the search party scoured the riverbank, had Brom lingered near the bridge, kicking at the scorched earth with a smile twisting his lips? Katrina watched it all unfold from her bedroom window, the ghost of Ichabod's last touch still warm on her wrist. She'd warned him, but Brom's pride had always been a weapon, and jealousy. That was a kind of madness. As the sun dipped below the trees, the Hollow's children were herded inside earlier than usual, doors locked, candles lit. Because while the adults might pretend this was just another tragedy, the children knew better. They'd seen the way the shadows pooled thicker near the old elm, how the wind carried laughter when no one was there to make it. And they'd heard the stories how the horseman didn't just take heads. He took memories, erased men so completely even their names turned to dust. By nightfall, Sleepy Hollow had already begun the quiet work of forgetting Ichabod Crane. All except Katrina, who lay awake listening to the distant sound of hooves on the road, and Brom, who stood at his window with a pumpkin in his hands, humming a soldier's tune as he carved. The floorboards of the old schoolhouse groaned under Katrina's weight as she slipped inside, the air thick with dust and the lingering scent of ink. Moonlight streamed through the warped glass of the windows, painting silver stripes across Ichabod's desk, still littered with papers, as if he'd stepped out for a breath of air and never returned. Her fingers trembled as she lifted a yellowed page, the cramped handwriting unmistakably his. The horseman cannot cross the bridge, he'd scrawled, but what if the bridge isn't his prison? What if it's ours? A chill skittered down her spine. Beneath the notes on local folklore lay sketches, rough, frantic lines of a headless rider, yes, but also maps. The Van Tassel estate, the mill pond, the stretch of road where Pieter Van Gerrit's body had been found decades ago, and in the margins a single name, circled over and over until the quill had torn through the paper: Brom. Katrina's breath hitched. She'd known Brom since childhood, had laughed at his jokes and rolled her eyes at his boasts. But these weren't the paranoid scribblings of a superstitious outsider. Ichabod had pieced together a pattern, one that led back to the Hollow's oldest wounds, the Van Gerrit land dispute, the card game that had left Brom's father with half the valley. The way Pieter's head had never been found, just like Ichabod's. A floorboard creaked behind her. She whirled, heart pounding, but the doorway stood empty. Only the wind rattling the latch, or so she told herself. Yet as she gathered the papers, something fluttered to the floor. A torn playbill for a traveling theater troupe, dated the week before Ichabod disappeared. Scrawled across it in Brom's unmistakable hand, the role of a lifetime. Outside, an owl screamed. Katrina stuffed the notes into her bodice, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The legend of the horseman had always been Sleepy Hollow's shield, a story to explain the unexplainable. But what if the real monster wasn't a ghost at all? What if he'd been sitting at her dinner table, smiling as he carved pumpkins with hands that knew exactly how a blade felt when it met flesh? The schoolhouse door swung shut behind her with a click, like a pistol's hammer. Somewhere in the hollow, a horse whinnied too close, too familiar, and for the first time in her life, Katrina wondered if the stories weren't meant to keep the darkness out, but to keep the truth locked in. Katrina's knuckles turned white around the crumpled playbill as she pushed open the door to Brom's hunting lodge. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows over the walls, lined with trophies, antlers, fox pelts, and one empty space where a saber usually hung. Brom stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders tense beneath his linen shirt. He didn't turn, not even when her boots struck the floorboards with deliberate force. "You knew," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You knew what would happen to him." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of dying embers. Then Brom let out a slow breath, his reflection grimacing in the glass. "I just wanted to scare him," he admitted, fingers tapping against the windowsill. "Dress up like the old stories, give him a good fright enough to send him packing back to the city, where he belonged." He turned then, and the guilt in his eyes was worse than any lie. "But I never touched him after the bridge, swear it on my father's grave." Katrina's laugh was sharp as broken glass, and the pumpkin, the hoof prints. The way the whole village heard the horseman that night, Brom's face paled. He crossed to the hearth, nudging a half-carved pumpkin with his boot, its jagged mouth unfinished, its inside still wet and glistening. "I left before dawn," he muttered, "thought I'd won, but when I came back for my horse," his jaw worked as if the words were stones in his throat. It was gone, saddle and all, like something had taken it. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and for the first time, Katrina noticed the tremor in Brom's hands, the way his gaze kept darting to the tree line beyond the yard. The arrogance that usually clung to him like a second skin had peeled away, leaving something raw beneath. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then who chased him, Brom? Who did we hear laughing?" The silence that followed was thicker than fog. Brom opened his mouth, just as a sound cut through the night, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster, shaking the ground beneath them, and laughter. Not Brom's rough chuckle, but something colder, older, curling through the trees like smoke. Brom's tankard hit the floor with a clatter, cider spilling across the boards like blood. "That's not me," he breathed. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, tearing leaves from the branches and sending them skittering across the porch. Somewhere in the hollow, a horse screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. Katrina backed toward the door, her pulse roaring in her ears. The legend had always been Sleepy Hollow's shadow, a tale to explain the unexplainable. But the truth was worse. The horseman wasn't just real, he'd been watching, waiting, and now he had a new debt to collect. Brom's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "You don't go out there," he hissed, his eyes wild. "Not tonight, not ever." Beyond the window, the moon vanished behind a bank of clouds, plunging the yard into darkness. And in that darkness, something moved, a shape, astride a horse that stood too still, too silent, waiting. Katrina wrenched free, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stories had been wrong about one thing. The horseman didn't just take heads, he took liars, and Brom had given him the perfect reason to ride. The first scream tore through Sleepy Hollow just past midnight, a sound not of fear, but of something far worse, recognition. Old Man Van Ripper's prized milk cow lay dead in the pasture, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, the grass around her scorched black in the shape of massive hoofprints. By the time the village stirred from its terrified silence, 3 more horrors had unfolded. The church doors hung splintered from their hinges, deep gashes marring the wood like claw marks. Every pumpkin in Widow Pete's patch had been smashed, their pulpy innards strewn across the road in a grotesque trail leading straight to the Van Tassel estate. And worst of all, the covered bridge, that fragile barrier between the living and the dead, now bore a single, chilling addition: a Hessian soldier's tattered cloak, nailed to the center beam with a rusted saber still dripping with river water. Brom Bones stood at the edge of the chaos, his usual swagger replaced by a sickening weight in his gut. This wasn't the mischief he'd planned. No stolen kisses from Katrina, no drunken laughter at Ichabod's expense. The air itself felt wrong, thick with the scent of damp earth and old blood. When the wind carried the distant sound of galloping hooves from the western woods, even the village dogs refused to bark, cowering beneath porches with their tails between their legs. Brom knew that sound. He'd mimicked it himself just nights before, thumping his boots against his stallion's sides to send Ichabod fleeing in terror. But the rhythm now was different, slower, heavier, as if the rider carried the weight of centuries. Inside the tavern, villagers clustered around flickering candles, their faces drawn tight with a fear Sleepy Hollow hadn't known since the war. Maik van der Veen clutched her rosary so tightly, the beads left indentations in her palms. "You woke him," she whispered, her milky eyes fixed on Brom with an accusation sharper than any blade. Played at being the horseman, and now the real one's come to collect his due. The words hung in the air, twisting like smoke. Brom wanted to laugh it off, to remind them all it was just stories, just superstition. But the proof was outside, in the shattered fences, and the way the trees seemed to lean away from the road, as if recoiling from something unseen. By the time Brom reached the stable, his mind was made up. He'd donned his father's old militia coat, the wool scratchy against his skin, and strapped on a pistol so ancient it might have fired at the real Hessian a lifetime ago. It wasn't guilt that drove him, not exactly, more the unshakable sense that he'd pulled a thread loose from the fabric of the world, and now the whole tapestry was unraveling. As he swung onto his horse, the animal shied beneath him, nostrils flaring at some scent Brom couldn't detect. "Easy, boy," he murmured, patting its neck. "We fix this tonight." The hollow held its breath as he rode out. Curtains twitched in darkened windows, but no one called out, no one offered to join him. They knew what rode the roads tonight, and it wasn't anything a living man could reason with. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch snapped. Brom's hand went to his pistol, just as the wind carried a sound that stopped his heart cold. Not hoof beats this time, but music. A soldier's march, played on a flute so warped by time, the notes came out twisted, mournful. The same tune he'd hummed while carving that damned pumpkin. His horse reared with a scream, nearly throwing him as the trees ahead shuddered, not from wind, but from the force of something massive moving through them. Something that laughed as it came. The musket's roar shattered the night, the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging thick in the air as Brom Bones stared down the barrel at the thing that had once been a man. The bullet should have torn through cloth and bone, should have sent the horseman reeling back into whatever hell he'd crawled from. Instead, It passed clean through the specter's chest like smoke, embedding itself in the bridge's railing with a splintering crack. Brom's breath hitched. The stories never mentioned this. The horseman didn't flinch, didn't stagger. He simply tilted that awful, empty space where his head should have been, the tattered edges of his uniform fluttering in a wind that didn't touch the trees. The saber in his grip caught the moonlight, its edge gleaming with a hunger no mortal metal could possess. Brom's fingers trembled against the musket stock. He'd faced down bears in these woods, brawled with thieves twice his size, but this was the kind of terror that turned bones to water. The blade rose, slow and deliberate, and Brom knew this wasn't just vengeance. It was a reckoning. The horseman had come for the liar who dared to wear his face, to mock his legend. Brom squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the bite of steel. Then the crow screamed. A single, piercing cry split the night, so loud it seemed to shake the very bridge beneath Brom's boots. The horseman's sword arm froze mid-swing. His horse, no, not a horse. Nothing living ever moved like that, pawed at the planks, its glowing eyes flicking toward the tree line. Brom dared to look. Perched on the bridge's arched roof, wings spread like a cloak, sat the largest crow he'd ever seen. Its feathers were blacker than the hollow's deepest shadows, its beak parted in what could only be a grin. And when it called again, the sound wasn't avian. It was human, a laugh, a woman's laugh. Recognition slammed into Brom like a musket ball. Katrina, the horseman's headless form, twisted toward the sound, his fury palpable in the sudden drop of temperature. The crow took flight, darting just out of reach, taunting. And in that heartbeat of distraction, Brom moved, not toward safety, not toward the village, but forward. One boot planted on the bridge's edge, he reached for the only weapon left to him, the truth. "I dressed as you," he rasped, the words tearing from his throat like splinters. Played the fool to scare a man who thought himself too clever for ghosts. But he's gone now, and if you're here for justice, take the one who called you. His hand shook as he pressed it to his own chest. Not the hollow, not them. The saber trembled in the horseman's grip. Somewhere in the trees, the crow's laughter faded into the whisper of wings. And for the first time in centuries, the bridge between the living and the dead held its breath. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches knitting together like skeletal fingers as Ichabod Crane stepped into the moonlight. Alive but not untouched, his coat hung in tatters, his face gaunt beneath streaks of dirt and dried blood, yet his eyes burned with a clarity that hadn't been there before, a knowledge that clung to him like the scent of damp earth. "He's not just a ghost," Ichabod murmured, his voice rough from days spent silent in the hollow's darkest corners. "He's a prisoner." The horseman's horse stamped its hooves, steam curling from its nostrils as its rider turned slowly toward the sound of Ichabod's voice. That empty space where a head should have been seemed to focus, as if the curse that bound him recognized the man who'd nearly been its next victim. Brom staggered back, his bravado crumbling. "You're supposed to be gone." Ichabod's smile was thin, humorless. He lifted a hand, revealing a tattered scrap of parchment. A soldier's letter, the ink faded but the plea still legible. "Find my head and set me free." "I hid in the old mill by the river," he continued, eyes never leaving the horseman. "Listen to the stories the wind carried. The Hessian didn't choose this fate." His head wasn't lost in battle. It was taken, hidden away to keep him tethered to this land. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of rotting leaves and something metallic, something old. The horseman's saber trembled in his grip, his posture shifting no longer predatory, but almost expectant. Ichabod took a step forward, the crow that had been Katrina circling overhead, now landing on his shoulder with a soft croak. "The Van Garrett boy," he said quietly. "Pieter, they said he drowned, but the mill pond wasn't deep enough, and his body," he glanced at Brom, whose face had gone ashen. "It washed up, missing the one thing the horseman needs most." The truth settled over the bridge like a shroud. The curse wasn't just about vengeance. It was about justice, and the key to breaking it had been buried in Sleepy Hollow's soil for generations, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to dig it up. Ichabod turned to the horseman, his voice barely above a whisper. "Show me where they left you." For the first time in 200 years, the ghost lowered his blade. The old Van Garrett ledger crumbled at the edges as Katrina traced her finger down the brittle pages. The ink faded to ghostly whispers of the past. Moonlight pooled across the desk in her father's study, illuminating a single entry dated October 31st, 1776, the night Pieter Van Garrett disappeared. "It's here," she breathed, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves outside. The mill pond wasn't an accident. They weighted his coat with stones, but his head. Her throat tightened. They took it, buried it somewhere the Hessian could never follow. Brom's shadow loomed over the page, his usual swagger replaced by a grim focus. The pistol at his hip felt heavier tonight, not with the weight of lead, but with the dawning realization of what his family had stolen all those years ago. "The old oak," he muttered, tapping a line near the bottom of the page. "Where the property lines met, that's where my grandfather marked it." His jaw worked as if the words tasted bitter. But the blight took that tree decades back. The land's all brambles now. Ichabod stepped into the circle of lamplight, his borrowed coat hanging loose over shoulders, still sharp from days spent hiding in the hollow's underbelly. The crow, Katrina's crow, perched on the windowsill behind him, its beady eyes reflecting the flame. "Then we follow the roots," he said quietly, "not the tree itself, but what it guarded. The earth remembers. The woods swallowed them whole the moment they left the estate's glow, the path vanishing beneath a tangle of thorns and thyme. Katrina led the way, her lantern cutting through the mist like a blade, its light catching on the occasional notch in a stump or the glint of a rusted nail. Old surveyor's marks, guiding them deeper into territory the Hollow had tried to forget. Every few steps, the wind carried a sound that wasn't wind at all, the distant jingle of bridle rings, the creak of leather. The horseman was near, and he was waiting. Brom's boot struck something hollow beneath the undergrowth. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt until his fingers brushed against splintered wood, the remains of a crate, its slats rotted but still bearing the Van Garrett crest. Inside, nestled in a bed of moss gone brittle with age, lay the answer to 2 centuries of nightmares. The skull's empty sockets seemed to stare up at them, the jaw still clenched in a silent scream. A branch snapped behind them. The lantern's flame guttered as the temperature plummeted, their breath fogging in the sudden chill. The horseman didn't ride into the clearing so much as the night itself parted for him, his steed's hooves making no sound as they touched the ground. That terrible, headless silhouette loomed over them, the saber trembling in his grip. Not with rage now, but something achingly human, hope. Katrina didn't hesitate. She lifted the skull with both hands, its weight far heavier than bone should be, and took a step forward. "You've been kept here long enough," she whispered. The words weren't just for the ghost, they were for Sleepy Hollow itself, for the lies festering in its soil. Somewhere in the trees, the crow let out a soft, approving croak. And for the first time in 200 years, the hollow held its breath. The earth beneath the gnarled oak was unnaturally cold, resisting the shovel's bite as if the soil itself remembered what had been buried there. Ichabod's palms blistered with each strike, the worn handle groaning in protest. Beside him, Brom worked in grim silence, his usual bravado stripped away by the weight of what they sought. Katrina knelt at the edge of the pit, her lantern flickering as the wind whispered through the branches above, a sound too much like voices, too much like laughter. Then the shovel struck wood. The rotten lid of the coffin splintered with a crack that echoed through the hollow, releasing a gust of air that smelled of damp stone and old iron. Inside, wrapped in what might have been a Hessian sash, lay the skull. Its yellowed surface was etched with grooves, not from time, but from blade marks. A trophy, not a casualty. Ichabod's breath hitched. This wasn't just a dead man's remains. It was a key. The temperature plummeted. Katrina's lantern snuffed out as if unseen fingers had pinched the flame. The oak's branches trembled, though no wind stirred them now, and then hoof beats. Not the steady rhythm of Brom's stallion, or the scattered panic of a spooked mare, but the slow, deliberate cadence of something that took its time, because it knew its prey couldn't run. The horseman emerged from the trees like smoke given form, his saber glinting with a light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The empty space where his head should have been seemed to pulse, drawn to the skull in Ichabod's hands as if by some cursed magnetism. Brom lunged for his pistol, but the weapon slipped from his fingers, landing in the dirt with a thud that sounded too much like a judge's gavel. Ichabod didn't think. As the horseman charged, his spectral steed's eyes burning like coals, Ichabod hurled the skull into the path of those thundering hooves. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath, then impact. Bone met shadow, and the night erupted in a sound like 1,000 whispers finally given voice. The skull screamed, not in pain, but in recognition, as if the pieces of a soul torn apart 2 centuries ago were at last crashing back together. The horseman's form shuddered, his outline blurring like ink in water. The saber slipped from his grasp, dissolving midair before it could strike the ground. And as the first light of dawn crept over the treetops, the ghostly steed reared one final time, not in fury, but in something almost like gratitude before crumbling into mist that scattered on the wind. Where the skull had landed, a single, fragile thing remained, a scrap of fabric, its edges frayed, but its colors still vivid after all these years. The sash of a soldier who died far from home, now finally at rest. Katrina reached for it, her fingers trembling, but the moment she touched the cloth, it too dissolved, not into nothingness, but into a handful of autumn leaves, dry and light as the hollow's oldest secrets. The oak stood silent above them, its roots no longer heavy with stolen history, and somewhere in the distance, a crow took flight, its wings slicing through the morning air with a freedom that hadn't been possible until now. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the skull arced through the moonlight, spinning end over end toward the horseman's outstretched hands. Time stretched thin in that heartbeat, long enough for Ichabod to see the moment bone met shadow, the way the fractured edges glowed like embers before knitting together with an audible click. A sound that wasn't just heard, but felt, reverberating through the hollow like a lock turning after centuries. The transformation was instantaneous. The tattered Hessian uniform mended itself stitch by spectral stitch, the fabric regaining its long-lost color, deep blue wool, silver buttons polished to a mirror shine. The headless void, filled with the sharp planes of a young soldier's face, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes wide with the shock of sudden wholeness. For the first time in 200 years, the horseman breathed, not air, but something older, the weight of unfinished business, finally slipping from his shoulders. He swayed in the saddle, one gauntleted hand rising to touch his newly restored throat, his lips parting in silent wonder. When his gaze found Ichabod's, there were no words. None were needed. That single nod carried the gratitude of generations. For the teacher who'd refused to stop digging, for the truth that had clawed its way out of Sleepy Hollow's shallow grave. Then the mist came, not the creeping fog that haunted the hollow's low places, but something luminous, almost tender. It curled around the soldier's boots first, then his waist, his chest, until only his face remained visible, just for a moment, before dissolving like sugar in tea. His horse, no longer a nightmare creature, but a proud chestnut stallion, tossed its head and whinnied once, a sound so ordinary it made Katrina's eyes sting. Then it too was gone, leaving behind only the faintest imprint of hooves in the dew-damp grass. The silence that followed was different now, not the thick, watchful quiet of a place holding its breath, but the gentle hush of a story reaching its end. Somewhere in the trees, a nightingale began to sing, a sound Sleepy Hollow hadn't heard since before the war. The wind carried the scent of apple blossoms instead of gunpowder. And high above, the stars seemed to burn a little brighter, as if the universe itself had sighed in relief. Brom was the first to move, his boot scuffing against the upturned earth where the skull had lain. "It's done then," he murmured, not quite a question. The weight in his voice suggested he knew better than most what they'd uncovered, not just a ghost's rest, but the hollow's own buried sins. Katrina reached for Ichabod's hand, her fingers threading through his with a certainty that hadn't been there before. Together, they watched the first true sunrise in weeks paint the treetops gold. No galloping hooves echoed in the distance, no laughter twisted through the branches, just the ordinary, beautiful sounds of a world waking up, free at last from the shadow of a story that had outstayed its welcome. The road back to the village felt lighter underfoot, as if the very ground had been waiting for this, and as they passed the covered bridge, Ichabod couldn't help but notice the wood no longer groaned beneath their steps. It simply held them, steady and silent, like it was finally just a bridge again. The bonfire in Sleepy Hollow's square burned brighter than any in living memory, its flames licking at the autumn sky as villagers toasted with cider that tasted sweeter without the aftertaste of fear. Children wove between the tables, their laughter bouncing off the church walls, no longer hushed or hurried inside before dark. Even the trees seemed to stand straighter, their branches no longer twisted into shapes that looked like grasping hands in the twilight. But Ichabod Crane lingered at the edge of the celebration, his cup untouched, his eyes tracing the silhouette of the covered bridge in the distance. He'd solved the mystery, yes. But solutions, he'd learned, had a way of unraveling into new stories over time. Already, he'd heard Widow Pete telling the children the horseman had been banished by a blessed pumpkin, while old Mike swore it was her rosary that did the trick. The truth, the bones, the betrayal, the blood debt would blur into something softer, safer. Another fireside tale. Katrina's voice pulled him back. They'll believe what they need to, she said, handing him a slice of apple cake still warm from the oven. Her fingers brushed his, lingering just a moment too long. Behind her, Brom stood with his arms crossed, but the usual challenge in his gaze had dulled to something quieter. Resignation, maybe, or respect. The three of them shared a look that needed no words. They were the only ones who'd ever know what really happened in the hollow that autumn. Brom cleared his throat, toeing at the dirt with his boot. "Suppose I owe you an apology," he muttered, not quite meeting Ichabod's eyes. "And thanks." The admission seemed to cost him, but when Katrina squeezed his arm, some of the tension left his shoulders. Funny, Ichabod thought. Fear had carved cracks in all of them, but it was through those cracks that the light had gotten in. Brom and Katrina's childhood friendship had been tested, twisted, and somehow forged anew in the crucible of shared secrets. They'd carry those scars, but they'd carry them together. As the fiddles struck up a lively reel, Ichabod made his decision. Sleepy Hollow had given him answers, but it wasn't his home. He'd arrived a skeptic, certain the world could be measured and catalogued. He'd leave with a notebook full of things that defied explanation. The way the crow had known to lead him to the mill, the way the soldier's eyes had held his just before vanishing, the way the wind sometimes carried the echo of a flute when no one was there to play it. Some truths were too restless to stay buried, and if he couldn't convince the world of what he'd seen, well, he'd make sure the story lived on anyway. The next morning, as mist curled over the pumpkin patches like the hollow's last whispered goodbye, Ichabod turned his horse toward the road. Behind him, Katrina stood on the porch of the Van Tassel estate, one hand raised in farewell. Brom leaned against the fence beside her, his hat pulled low, but not low enough to hide the grudging nod he offered. Ichabod returned it. Then he nudged his mount forward, the saddlebags heavy with more than just supplies. They carried the weight of a tale that would outlast them all. Somewhere ahead, the bridge waited, not a barrier and a moor, just wood and nails and shadow, and as hooves clattered against the planks, Ichabod could have sworn he heard an answering set of steps, not behind him, but beside him, keeping pace for just a heartbeat before fading into the rhythm of the wind. The road stretched before Ichabod Crane like an unspooling ribbon, the morning mist clinging to his coat as if reluctant to let him go. Behind him, Sleepy Hollow shrank into the landscape, its chimneys smoking, its people stirring awake to a world no longer haunted. Yet as his horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the dirt, another sound threaded through the wind, faint at first, almost imagined, then clearer, the distant echo of galloping, perfectly matched to his own mount's pace. Ichabod stiffened, his fingers tightening on the reins. He didn't turn, didn't need to. Somewhere in the hollow's depths, between the rustling leaves and the creak of old branches, the story was settling back into the soil. Not gone, just waiting. Legends, he'd learned, were like the river under that bridge, always flowing, even when you couldn't see the current. The horseman might have found his rest, but the tale itself. That would linger, in the way parents still hurry their children inside at dusk, in the nervous laughter around harvest bonfires, in the way every snapped twig on a lonely road would always, for just a heartbeat, sound like hoofbeats. Ichabod allowed himself a small smile. Let them whisper, let them wonder. Stories like these weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be passed down, changing shape with each telling, growing new roots in fertile imaginations. A crow burst from the tree line ahead, its wings cutting through the mist like scissors through cloth. For an instant, its cry sounded almost human, a woman's voice, warm and knowing. Then it was just a bird again, vanishing into the dawn. Ichabod nudged his horse forward. The road beckoned, and with it, new mysteries. But as the first true rays of sunlight painted the hills gold, he could have sworn the wind carried one last whisper, not a threat, but a promise. Sleepy Hollow remembers, and so, perhaps, would he. you.